At first glance, Thomas Campbell seemed to lead a life that many would envy. He was a well-respected member of his community in a small, peaceful town in the Midwest. Thomas worked as an accountant, had a steady job, and lived in a well-kept suburban home with his wife, Susan, and their 2 children. The Campbell family was the definition of normal. They attended church every Sunday, spent holidays with family, and were well-liked by their neighbors. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But behind closed doors, there were secrets that no one could have imagined. Thomas, known for his easygoing demeanor, was hiding a dark side, and what began as a seemingly normal life would soon spiral into one of the most shocking cases in recent history. The town had no idea that the quiet, smiling Thomas Campbell would soon be at the center of a horrific crime that would haunt the community for years. A missing persons report. It all began with the disappearance of Thomas's wife, Susan Campbell, in 2015. One evening, she left their home to run some errands and never returned. Thomas reported her missing to the local police the next morning, claiming he had no idea where she had gone or what might have happened to her. He was visibly distressed, and many who knew him believed his story. For days, the police searched for Susan. They questioned Thomas, combed through their home, and spoke to friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from Susan in over 48 hours. Thomas's behavior appeared to be that of a concerned husband, frantic, worried, and actively cooperating with the investigation. The police, like everyone else, believed that Susan had simply run away or was lost. But as time passed, the investigation took a disturbing turn. Despite their efforts, there were no signs of Susan. No phone calls, no texts, and no evidence of her whereabouts. It seemed as though she had simply vanished off the face of the earth. A clue leads to unthinkable horror. Months passed without any trace of Susan Campbell. Then, in a turn of events that would haunt investigators, a local fisherman discovered a body in a remote area of the nearby river. The police were called to the scene, where they made the chilling identification. It was Susan Campbell. Her body had been hidden in the water for several weeks, and the condition of her remains suggested she had been violently murdered. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town. Susan's family and friends were devastated, and the police were faced with a chilling realization. They were no longer investigating a missing person case. They were now investigating a murder. The police turned their attention back to Thomas, who had once again appeared devastated by the news. His grief seemed genuine, but there was something unsettling about his reaction. He had been acting so calm and composed, as though he was hiding something. His public demeanor was becoming harder to ignore, and the cracks in his story were starting to show. The secret life, Thomas's dark past. As the investigation into Susan's death deepened, the police uncovered troubling details about Thomas's past. They discovered that he had a history of violent behavior that he had kept hidden for years. While his outward persona had always been that of a mild-mannered accountant, Thomas had been involved in multiple violent altercations during his youth, including incidents of domestic violence and aggression toward former partners. This information raised serious questions about Thomas's involvement in his wife's murder. The police began to believe that his calm demeanor might not have been genuine grief, but rather a reflection of his calculated nature. It seemed increasingly likely that Thomas had known more about Susan's death than he had let on. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered even more unsettling details. It turned out that Thomas had been involved in several extramarital affairs, which had caused friction in his marriage. Susan had reportedly discovered one of these affairs just weeks before her disappearance, and the couple had been experiencing significant marital problems. This information suggested that there could have been a motive for Thomas to kill his wife. Thomas finally breaks. After months of investigation, the police finally had enough evidence to confront Thomas directly. They had gathered witness testimony, phone records, and other key pieces of evidence that suggested he had been responsible for Susan's death. But it wasn't until they confronted him with the mounting evidence that Thomas finally cracked. In a long, emotionally charged interrogation, Thomas Campbell broke down and confessed to killing his wife. He admitted that the pressure from his extramarital affairs, combined with his feelings of frustration and anger towards Susan, had driven him to murder. He had staged Susan's disappearance to look like a random act of violence, but in truth, he had killed her in a fit of rage. According to Thomas, Susan had confronted him about his affair and threatened to expose him, which pushed him over the edge. In a violent confrontation, he strangled her and then disposed of her body in the river, hoping to make it look like an accident. The confession was chilling and left the police in utter disbelief. They had been investigating Thomas for months, and yet no one had suspected that he could be capable of such brutality. A community struggles to understand. The trial of Thomas Campbell began in 2017, and it quickly became a media sensation. The small town that had once viewed Thomas as a beloved, upstanding citizen now had to grapple with the reality that their neighbor was a cold-blooded killer. The courtroom was filled with people who had known Thomas and Susan for years, and many of them were shocked by the revelation of his dark side. During the trial, the prosecution presented the details of Thomas's confession, as well as the evidence that had been gathered throughout the investigation. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully orchestrated his wife's murder and tried to cover up his crime. The defense team tried to argue that Thomas had acted out of emotional distress, but the jury was unconvinced. In the end, Thomas Campbell was found guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction brought some sense of justice to Susan's family, but it did little to alleviate the pain of her loss. Her children were left to grow up without their mother, and the community was left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that had shattered their sense of trust. The devastating impact on the community. The impact of Susan's death on the community was profound. Thomas had been a familiar face to everyone in the small town, and the realization that he was capable of murder left many people in a state of shock. Friends and family of the Campbell family struggled to understand how someone they had trusted could commit such an unthinkable crime. Susan's parents in particular were devastated. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way possible, and no amount of justice could ever bring her back. The children, too, were left to cope with the aftermath of their father's actions. They would forever be marked by the knowledge that their father had killed their mother, and their lives would never be the same. The dark side of the ordinary. The story of Thomas Campbell is a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. He had lived a life that seemed perfect to everyone around him. He was an upstanding citizen, a loving father, and a devoted husband. No one could have predicted that this seemingly ordinary man was capable of committing such a heinous crime. The case also highlights the dangers of keeping secrets and the emotional toll that living a double life can take. Thomas Campbell's affair, combined with his growing resentment towards his wife, ultimately led him to commit murder. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of honesty and the potential consequences of harboring dark secrets. A life lost, but not forgotten. In the end, Thomas Campbell's life was irrevocably changed. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be able to harm anyone again. His actions left a permanent scar on the community, and his family, especially Susan's children, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The case of Thomas Campbell is a heartbreaking reminder of the horrors that can be hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. No one could have imagined that the man who had once been so trusted and loved would be capable of such violence. As for Susan, her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her. And though she may be gone, she will never be forgotten.